2024 was not at all the movie year I anticipated. I thought that Hollywood strikes would leave behind a disappointing year, and for many people, it might have been. Certainly on the Hollywood side of things, where the box office numbers look similar to last year's instead of an ideal increase as we move further from the pandemic. But if we're talking about the quality of the movies, and in this video, thankfully we are, getting to 20 picks for me was pretty easy. If anything, the hard part was cutting my list down to only 20 because this year was not at all disappointing. My picks for the year's great films range from blockbusters to underseen gems, first time directors to ones at the end of their career, horror to comedy, and everything in between. This year, I attended New York Film Festival, my first time ever attending a film festival. I also got to go to premieres for movies like Trap, where I got to meet one of my favorite working directors. In a year that might not be memorable to some, this one definitely will be for me. So let's get into my picks for the best movies of 2024. And I'll start by throwing out some honorable mentions since, like I said, it was hard to cut down the list to only 20 movies. There are plenty of movies I'd love to recommend that I spoke about highly all year, but that just missed the cut. The hardest to exclude were the three just outside of my top 20: Gladiator 2, The Beast, and Kneecap. Gladiator 2 was firmly on the list until I went and watched it a third time, perhaps one time too many. Whereas with The Beast, I have not had time to rewatch it, and it feels very much like a movie that I'd like to watch more than once. Kneecap is some of the most fun that I had in a theater all year, and it also put Kneecap's music on my radar, so even if it doesn't get a spot on the list, I feel like that's a pretty good consolation prize because I have listened to it a lot. There are also movies I decided do not meet my criteria because of their release dates, specifically The Shrouds, which would have been on this list, but it does not come out until spring of 2025 here in the United States, whereas other movies that you might find on this list get wide releases in like January and February and compete for Oscars, so I thought it would be fine to include them. It's usually not until the end of the year that I start watching the year's best documentaries, so I still have plenty of catching up to do, but I wanted to mention some of the best ones, like No Other Land, The Remarkable Life of Evelyn, and Daughters. There are some great movies that aren't quite feature length, like Chime and Rap World. And I'll finish the honorable mentions with two movies that contain two of my favorite lead performances of the year: Angelina Jolie in Maria, and Cillian Murphy, my favorite working actor, in Small Things Like These. Now, quickly before I get into my top 20, I want to give the disclaimer that I am just one guy. There are still so many movies from this year that I want to catch up on, but this video has to get made at some point, and I know that in 1 or 2 months from now, as I continue to catch up on them, I will have wanted to replace like half of this list. It also goes without saying, but these opinions are completely my own, and I hope that people choose to treat this list more like one reference point for the year's great movies rather than some heated ground for debate. At number 20, I've got Anora. Sean Baker's Best Picture frontrunner initially left me kind of conflicted. It's got a hilarious first half and then takes you on a real journey before reaching its emotional ending. That second half journey was not my favorite on first watch, but rewatching the film, I actually got really swept up in not just that part, but also thought that the comedy was even funnier and the ending was even more impactful. I still don't know how to weigh it against Baker's other work, but it does feature some expectedly great performances in the sense that Baker knows how to get them out of his actors, but unexpectedly great in their relative lack of star power. Yura Borisov is my favorite of the supporting performances, technically a star in his own right because of international acclaim, but not somebody who I was familiar with. I have to mention Karen Karagulian, a frequent Baker collaborator who makes this one as funny as it is. But of course, the person who you'll never again associate with a lack of star power is the star, Mikey Madison. At number 19, I've got Megalopolis. Megalopolis is a strange movie to talk about and a surprising pick for at least half of the people watching this, I'm sure, because of all of the movies that show up on the list, it is definitely the most hated. Troubling production and a controversial cast not only steered many away, but a lot of those it didn't certainly wish that they didn't spend their time on it. And yet, I find it way too fascinating of a movie to not give it a spot alongside my favorites of the year. A total mess to a majority of people, and in some cases, including mine, that messiness is a feature and not a flaw. But I don't want to act like it's some incomprehensible movie. Despite all of the ideas that it throws at you, some of which I don't even agree with, I still found that the story kept my attention the entire time. It's a decades in the making passion project from one of the greatest directors ever, and whether you like it or not, some of the best images of the year are found in it. I don't know how it'll age or what it will be remembered as, but at this moment in time, it feels like an essential artifact, and it is one that I do not want to let go of. At number 18, I've got Janet Planet. Janet Planet's director, Annie Baker, is a hugely successful playwright, but the film is a debut for her as a feature film director. It's small, but it's full of heart, and you see that in the mother and daughter relationship. If you're like me and can't directly relate to the mother and daughter relationship, you will still find yourself caring so much for Janet, and especially Lacey, who is portrayed by Zoe Ziegler in what might be the standout child performance of the year. This kind of subtle, quiet film is not going to be for everybody, but while I was watching it, I found myself comparing to some of my favorite directors like Mike Mills and Kelly Reichardt. I really shouldn't be surprised that a Pulitzer Prize winner could do this with their first film, but it's honestly surprising that this could be anybody's first film. Number 17 is Twilight of the Warriors Walled In. As the year was winding down, I found myself hesitant to check out this Hong Kong action film simply because there was so little time left to prepare for a video like this. But now I'm wishing that I watched Twilight of the Warriors Walled In over and over and over again. It's such an easy film to recommend because if I were to put it simply, it might be the most fun you have watching anything all year. It puts so many of our Hollywood action films to shame, not just in the craft on display in the action scenes, but in the tremendous world building. You get so sucked into the walled city, which, by the way, was a real place, that the 2 hours you spend in there with the characters does not feel like nearly enough. The good news is that a sequel and prequel are both apparently in the works, so anybody who loves this one as much as I did has that to look forward to. I'm sure I'd have more to say if I was well versed in Hong Kong action cinema and the relationship that this has to the movies that come before it. But those who are well versed can get that extra layer from it, and those who aren't could still have just as much of a blast as I did. Number 16 is All We Imagine as Light. I can probably echo a lot of what I just said about Janet Planet because All We Imagine as Light is another small film with lots of heart and a focus on just a few characters. But I think this one has stuck with me even more. I don't know if it's just the difference between seeing something at a festival rather than in a theater, but I think what it should actually be attributed to is the director, Payal Kapadia. Her recent Golden Globe nomination was so deserved that I was honestly shocked a show like that could make such an inspired choice. It sounds corny to describe a movie as human, but this one so effortlessly earns that label. I love projects like this that are just a handful of beautiful little moments coming together. It seems that the same few directors are mentioned in the group of newer rising talent, but there are few people that I would be excited to see a movie from more than Pyle Kapadia. Number 15 is Hard Truths. I had known about Mike Lee for a while, but only familiarized myself with his work by watching Naked less than a month before I had seen Hard Truths. Listening to him describe his process made me completely fall in love with his approach. It's this approach that helps bring out one of my very favorite performances of the year, Marion Jean Baptiste as Pansy. That director actor combination brings this whole thing to life. It's thanks to Jean Baptiste that this is easily the hardest I laughed at any movie all year, but it's also thanks to her that I found myself feeling so deeply for such a flawed character. Mike Lee also deserves credit for approaching a somewhat familiar story in a way that does not let us off easy. 9 out of 10 times you know exactly how the story would go, but that 10th time would be the best version of this movie, and that is what Mike Lee gives us. Number 14 is I Saw the TV Glow. I Saw the TV Glow was a sort of mini sensation in film lover circles, but those of us who had seen Jane Schoenbrun's We're All Going to the World's Fair knew there was a lot to be excited for, and for me, it lived up to that excitement. It's anchored by Justice Smith, who I have long been a huge fan of, but who sadly has been in very few good movies. Here, he gives one of the year's most underappreciated performances, one that turned me into a complete wreck by the end of the film. I think just how sad it ultimately ends up being could turn some people off because certain interpretations of the film can be quite pessimistic, but that aching pain I left the theater with is what made it end up being one of my favorites of the year. I'm just not sure anybody can make movies about our relationship to media like TV and the internet quite like Jane Schoenbrun does. And then, of course, it's one of the great movies about identity and what it's like trying to live as somebody that you're not. Number 13 is Furiosa. Mad Max Fury Road is one of my favorite movies ever, possibly the action movie of the past decade, so there was no doubt that a prequel helmed yet again by George Miller would find its way onto my favorites of the year. In certain ways, it's even better than Fury Road. It looks better than Fury Road, not so much a negative directed at Fury Road, a movie that also looks great, but just a sign that Miller still has more gas in the tank. Chris Hemsworth proves how good he is when he works outside of the MCU, and more importantly, shows how much fun he could have in a movie with some real craft behind it. But it's Anya Taylor-Joy who continues her rise to superstardom in a performance that requires so much good acting with so few lines to help. And those few lines are important to note because this isn't just a movie that should be compared to Fury Road. It might exist in the same world, but it has a very different approach from the nonstop thrills of that movie. I think the structure not only sets it apart, but offers some more thoughtful ideas by surrounding Furiosa with a world of men who have lost hope. Number 12 is The First Omen. We've had a lot of new releases since The First Omen, and not a single one has come anywhere close to being as surprising as this. A legacy prequel from a first time director starring somebody who I had only previously seen apparently in Game of Thrones. My expectations weren't low, they were sort of non existent. I never even really had an interest in it, and yet here we are. But it doesn't just get points for being surprising. It's the exact kind of horror movie I wish we had 10 of every year and that we fail to have even one of. Powerful and genuinely frightening, but never at the expense of making a great film, which Arkasha Stevenson clearly knows how to do. And that Game of Thrones actress I was referencing, Nell Tiger Free, should be at the top of casting lists everywhere. People like to talk about underappreciated horror movies, and I think a lot of those get a bit of a horror boost, but she is the real deal, and so is this movie. At number 11, I've got The Brutalist. A lot of people might think The Brutalist is placed a little bit too low for their liking, marketed as the big cinematic event of the year, and I get that after Oppenheimer, everybody wants an Oppenheimer every year. This isn't quite that, and it's also not a fair comparison. It's made for a tenth of the budget for starters, and I'm in awe of how that's even possible. Honestly, I'm kind of in awe of everything about this movie. But given all that's so impressive about it, it's not something I'm dying to return to, and no, that has nothing to do with how long it is. I actually ended up canceling tickets to see it a second time, and other factors might have contributed to that, but it also plays a role in why it's at the number 11 spot and not the number 1 spot. I'm not of the opinion that it'll age poorly because of what the ending might be saying. I think it's open to multiple interpretations, and I've had the same one since I left the theater. In fact, the ending plays a huge role in why I love it so much. In so many ways, it's as monumental as everybody says, from the sets to the performances to its place in our current zeitgeist, but it finds itself just outside my top 10. We'll revisit that choice in the future because despite everything I'm saying right now to downplay it, The Brutalist is a big deal. Number 10 is Juror Number 2. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I would include some directors at the end of their careers, and in the same way that The Brutalist is a massive achievement for making all of that work with such a small budget, Juror Number 2 is a massive achievement because at the time of this recording, Clint Eastwood is 94 years old. Maybe I'm partial to this kind of classic material that Eastwood is working with. Courtroom drama that never loses steam, people talking in rooms and revealing detail after detail. It's a movie you'd see everywhere you look 30 years ago and nowhere you look now. And that desire to return to an era where movies like this were the norm is definitely part of why this works for so many people. But it's also just amazing to see somebody go out fighting like this, to capture the doubt in the American justice system that you could find in every corner of the country. It's simple and complex all at once, rock solid filmmaking throughout, but never in sight of a solution. Just one old man telling us that we've got an imperfect system, and whether you're good or bad or anything in between, you'll either be hurt by it or help hurt somebody else. My number 9 pick is Red Rooms. I initially thought Red Rooms was not adding much to the conversation as far as true crime inspired films go, but it creeps its way into your brain like nothing else. Mostly because it's ultimately just a movie about why we're endlessly fascinated by something that's wrong, the curiosity that motivates us to do things we shouldn't. In that sense, Pascal Plante almost rivals Jane Schoenbrunn in understanding why we're so enamored by the world of the internet. This movie's subject is probably the most extreme version of that, but it's what makes it such a horrifying, nerve-wracking watch. It's also got Juliet Garapi going from quiet observer to total nightmare fuel. My rewatch of the movie is really what made me fall in love with her performance and also catch all of these details that have kept it in my mind. On first watch, I thought it was just a very well orchestrated thriller, and it is, but it's also so much more than that. Number 8 is The Seed of the Sacred Fig. I'll start by saying that what the Seed of the Sacred Fig eventually turns into in the third act is not going to work for everyone. The nearly 3-hour film takes its time establishing so much using mostly the space inside one family's home and using that space so well. But when it shifts gears, for me, it goes from great movie to one of the best of the year. A lot of the conversation about this film has involved director Mohammad Razulov's obstacles in getting it to reach our eyes, which involves fleeing his home country of Iran to live in Europe after being sentenced to prison for the making of this film. That on its own obviously makes this a daring film, one worth watching regardless, but I really appreciate how Razulov approaches these political issues with endlessly engaging debate. I haven't given much attention to scripts yet, and I've already mentioned plenty of movies with great ones, but the first 2 hours of The Seed of the Sacred Fig do not work without a perfect script, and luckily, it has that. There's no denying that something this courageous deserves your attention, but it deserves so much more than that. My number 7 pick is Queer. I don't want to spoil too much, but the fact that we're at the number 7 spot already, and this will not be the last time that Luca Guadagnino is mentioned, is just insane. Is he just the best working right now? Has he assembled the best team? Or is it both? Because I think it might be both. That team for both of his movies this year includes screenwriter Justin Kuritsky, cinematographer Sayambu Muktipram, and Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross working together as composers. Queer is a difficult adaptation for Kuritsky's, and he pulls it off brilliantly. I can tell you that this movie would be lower on the list if it were not for Muktipram shooting it. I particularly really like the out-of-body moments, which have continued to stick with me. But if I had to quickly summarize how good Muktipram is in the spirit of spoiling picks, I'll say that he shows up on this list again and not in a Luca movie. Daniel Craig continues to make great choices with the projects he picks, and this might be his best performance yet. Luca Guadagnino just makes movies for me. With this one specifically, he's communicating a lot without speaking, and the idea of someone's desires existing only in a world of their own creation has not left my mind. Number 6 is Nickel Boys. With every new person I talk to about the year's best movies, I always find myself recommending Nickel Boys. Just like Pyle Kapadia, who I mentioned earlier, I really think Ramel Ross is somebody to watch. But I'll go even further than that. After watching his previous work, a documentary called Hale County This Morning, This Evening, and then following it up with Nickel Boys, I'm not sure that there is a single new director that is more exciting. You'll hear a lot about how creative it is formally, and it's true. A story told from the first person perspective is a very unique experience. But it's not just about making a choice that's different, it's about how making that choice impacts you as you're watching it. I've rarely ever been so moved by the images in front of me, and I can definitely say I've never connected to characters in this way, where their faces are hidden from me for half of the movie. That also doesn't take away from the performances, though. There are great young stars elevating the material, like Ethan Harris, Brandon Wilson, and Fred Heckinger, as well as some stellar supporting performances. Anjanae Ellis Taylor is one of my favorite supporting performances in just her limited screen time. And speaking of the material and circling back to Ramel Ross's vision, to adapt a book like this by taking such a big swing with so much confidence and nailing it is a sure sign that it will live on. Number 5, Dune Part 2. We finally got that blockbuster I hinted at in the intro that you've all been waiting for. Denis Villeneuve's Dune is already an all-time favorite for me, so Part 2 was essentially my most anticipated movie of the year. And while I'm of the uncommon opinion that Part 1 is a tiny bit better, Part 2 still has all of the qualities that made me fall in love with it. I used to call Denis Villeneuve one of my favorite directors, and I know it's controversial, but I'm not sure that he is anymore. However, I think he's at his best when he's working on stuff of this scale, and he found the best material for him with Dune. Part 2 brings in new, exciting performances like Austin Butler as Fade Rotha, kicks off the year that we'll remember as Timothée Chalamet's ascent to movie star of our generation, but it really works because of supporting performances from people like Rebecca Ferguson and especially Javier Bardem, who is the heart of the film. I've had my fair share of moments raining on parades, even this year with movies like Deadpool and Wolverine, which I did not like, but blockbusters like Dune Part 2 remind you why the theater is such a special place. Seats vibrating, a world that feels too big for the screen, and moments that make you want to jump out of your seat and cheer. It led me to watch this 3 times in theaters this year, and these Denis Villeneuve Dune movies will always mean a lot to me. Number 4, Evil Does Not Exist. Speaking of movies that mean a lot to me, Evil Does Not Exist talks about nature in a way that I so passionately related to. It felt like it was impossible for a movie to capture my exact feelings, and yet this one completely understands them. It's a gorgeous effort from Ryosuke Hamaguchi, a director who I had previously only seen direct Drive My Car, one of the best movies of its own year, but who I'm eager to keep exploring in the future. It's a patient movie, but one that I personally get wrapped up in pretty easily. There's an extended scene of somebody just chopping wood, and I never felt that they should move on or cut a second earlier. The clash between capitalism and nature is explored so well, from the village meeting where characters debate it to the little details of those characters that help set them apart. And then we arrive at this ending that I don't want to spoil for anybody, but plays the biggest part in why this movie made its way so far up my list. It relates itself to the excellent title and gets me to question it for months and months and months now. This isn't a video about star ratings or assigning numbers to art. I mean, technically it is, but this is the last entry before we get to my 3 sort of 5-star movies of the year. And I want to say that this movie is so, so close to being there. And one more watch of it might have me declaring it a perfect movie. Number 3 is Trap. I've talked about movies that I watched at the New York Film Festival, but I also mentioned in the intro that one of the highlights of the year was attending the premiere of Trap, and only for a quick moment, meeting one of my favorite working directors, M. Night Shyamalan. It sounds like an event that would cloud my judgment, but I'm now separated from it enough to declare this one of the best movies of the year. The public has a complicated relationship with M. Night Shyamalan, and by complicated, I mean that they mostly hate him. But in growing to love him, I've become incapable of being bothered by the criticisms that are thrown at him with every release. Nobody talks like this. This is not how humans act, and so on and so on. And it's because his movies communicate ideas that I'm always affected by. Ultimately, he's just a director making movies about how much he loves his family. And if you know me, you know I will get emotional at the thought of that. Trap is a crazy meta example of that, placing his own daughter in the movie and making a film about a father who lives a double life. Sort of like that of a filmmaker, and how only in those two lives meeting does he realize that he might not have done enough for his daughter. You could get caught up in the logic of the details. A serial killer would get caught at a concert in minutes, but I choose to engage with the film as it's intended. And as a result, it finds its way this high on my list. It's also a hilarious movie, and again, intentionally so. The premiere crowd I watched the movie with was laughing the whole time. M. Night came out on stage before the movie and said it was the funniest movie he's written yet. And still, after the movie, half of them hated it. It almost feels unfair because the movie is everything he wants it to be. It's got the laughs, it's got the visuals from Mukti Prom, who I mentioned would come up again. It's got the heart, and it's got the heart net performance, which is one of the best and definitely one of the most fun of the year. When I talk about movies from this year that I will be watching over and over and over again for the rest of my life, this is at the front of the conversation. My number two pick is La Chimera. Much like Evil Does Not Exist, La Chimera meets me on that wavelength that feels so specific to me, it has me questioning whether this movie was made only for my eyes. Funnily enough, one of my favorite parts of the movie is when a character declares that a piece of art is not for human eyes. It's the relationship this movie has with art and love and the past and how we interact with it in regard to those two things that has made it so special for me. Something else worth mentioning, though, is that despite all of the Dune Part 2s of the year, this was the best theater experience I had all year. Watched it seated smack in the middle of the theater with nobody else in the room with me. And for 2 hours, I felt like I wasn't in my own body, like I had followed Josh O'Connor into a world that I don't exist in. And on the subject of Josh O'Connor, it was seeing him in this movie and then less than 2 weeks later seeing him in Challengers that cemented him as my actor to watch. The strength of those two performances alone is enough to get him to compete for the title of my favorite working actor. I'd love to show some appreciation for a supporting performance from Carol Duarte that won't get much love anywhere else, but that helps bring this entire thing to life. And I can't move on without mentioning Alice Rohrwacher, who is the director of the film and who made a movie that I can only describe as a miracle. But my top spot has to go to the Luca Guadagnino directed, Zendaya, Josh O'Connor, and Mike Feist starring love triangle movie, Challengers. Wouldn't call sports movies my favorite subgenre, but they do bring to the screen my next biggest passion after movies, of course. That's not enough to earn Challengers a top spot, though. After all, I was quite affected by a Roger Federer documentary this year, and that comes nowhere close to getting a spot on this list. If we want to get flexible with the definition of a sports movie, we could even include Argyle, which has a scene where Samuel L. Jackson watches a Lakers game. But we should probably save that for a different discussion, the worst movies of 2024. What makes Challengers so special is that in all of my years as a sports fan and watching them portrayed on screen, I have not seen anything like it. You can't even compare it to the great sports movies like Rocky or Hoop Dreams or anything in between because it brings to the surface ideas that I've always considered but I've never seen spoken about. The inherent sexuality of bodies on display captured through the camera perfectly framing Mike Feist's chest or Josh O'Connor's sweat dripping onto the court. How competition not only drives interpersonal relationships but sexual ones and the blurred lines between the two. Lots of this, of course, should be attributed to Luca Guadagnino's excellent direction and Justin Kuritsky's screenplay. Kuritsky's responsible for the ideas, and Guadagnino knowing just how to translate them. But I want to make sure to mention three other important contributors who, just like Kuritsky's, were mentioned when I talked about Guadagnino's other movie, Queer. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross providing the score, and Sayambu Mukti vision as the cinematographer. It's because of those three that the tennis scenes are as energetic as they are. The score so correctly capturing the back and forth of a tennis match, and Mukti Prom setting a new bar for how good a sports movie could look. I'm not sure any other moment in a recent sports movie or any sports movie ever, regardless of how well they're directed, could compete with the tennis ball turned camera in Challengers. And focusing so much on it as a sports movie is honestly a failure on my part because this could still work if you took the sports completely out of it. The triangle between Tashi, Art, and Patrick for me is enough under any circumstances. Their relationships fascinate me, and Zendaya, Josh O'Connor, and Mike Feist couldn't be any better. Of course, I'm especially wowed by Josh O'Connor, who, like I said when talking about La Chimera, has become one of my favorite actors this year. In summary, Challengers is everything I could have wanted. It's smart, it's sexy, it's funny, and to put it simply, it's just entertaining. Most importantly, it's got a scene about the importance of a trip to Applebee's, which will only ring true for a select few, but I am one of them. It's as close as we got to a perfect movie this year, and it's my pick for the best movie of the year. I want to say thank you for watching because this is my first time doing long form film content on YouTube. I know the product is not perfect, but this is something I look forward to doing more of moving forward. So you can let me know if you liked it. You can let me know what your favorite movies of the year are. And you could follow me on other platforms like TikTok, Twitter, or wherever else you could find me. All of those links will be in the description.